All right, folks. So I only see one person in the chat who admits to finding the polar bear. Has anybody else spotted it? Can you circle it? Yeah, go ahead, sir, Laura. Nope, that's not where the polar bear is, Laura. That's where the polar bear is, over here. So, ghost of one then. Yeah, okay. When I was looking through this image trying to find it, I did not expect something that size. I was really surprised at how big it was. But there it is. They're freaking massive.
They're enormous.
Yes. It's easy to forget how big these things are. Okay. All right. So again, there's some assignments up that are due on Friday this week. There will be a new quiz and some short answer questions posted on Friday, which, as we all know by now, probably means Saturday. But those will be due on Friday, April 7th. And then the project is due on Sunday, April 16th. So we're getting kind of close to that because we're almost in April now. So keep an eye on the schedule. Make sure that you get it done in time. If you signed up for live presentations, we're going to be doing those on April 18th. I think we have few enough that we can do them all in one day. But if I look and we have a lot more, there may be some that are put off till April 20th. How do we do pre-recorded? Well, I hope you know how to record yourself doing it. If not, that's definitely email level answer. But basically, you record it and then you will send me the link in my email, and then I will deal with the rest of it. Any other project questions? Okay. So, I have my lecture notes for my other class. I don't think you guys want to hear about the Black Death. Okay.
Yes, I do.
Of course you do, Ronit.
I was gonna say that sounds very intriguing, whatever that is.
Yeah, it's a good class as long as I have students who participate. This semester, the students are not very participatory, which makes it hard. Okay. But we're talking about genetics. Yeah, okay, everybody's interested in the Black Death, huh? Okay, well, be glad COVID is not nearly as bad as the Black Death, because whoo, nasty. But as I said, we're talking birds. Birds had nothing to do with the Black Death. Specifically, we are talking genetics today. No worries, Dan. Happens to all of us. Okay, so when we talk about genetics, just let me remind everybody, we're talking about inheritance of characteristics from parents to offspring. And the inheritance is in genes, which are on molecules called chromosomes. The genes can come in different versions And we call those different versions alleles. So I need to add two more words, phenotype and genotype. So these kind of sound, unfamiliar. Phenotype is the physical trait. So it's what we can actually detect. So when we're talking in this class, we're really going to be focusing on things like color, appearance, but it can also be risk of cancer, risk of liver problems, how well you metabolize in humans lactose. Birds don't manage to digest lactose very well. Genotype is the identity of the alleles or variations in the genes. So if we remember, let's see. We had gone through a couple of these slides last time. Here we have, hang on, I got to erase the words that I wrote earlier. Here we have two lovebirds. This is what's called the wild type, which means it looks like the wild peach-faced lovebird. And to get that wild appearance, we say the genotype is GG, two lowercase g's. And we say that because the allele for this color is indicated with the letter G. If we look at this other guy, this is a pied lovebird. So in this case, the gene is here, it's in the same location on the same chromosome, and the pied allele is indicated as GP. So it's the G gene, P is pied. And so its genotype would be listed as GPGP. Phenotype, wild green or pied. Does that make sense? Okay.
Why are we writing the genotype for the wild with two lowercase g's?
We are writing the genotype for the wild in lowercase because it is recessive. So we haven't really gotten to dominance and recessive. That's in the next slide. Okay. So for some alleles, but not all, there will be one that is dominant and one that is called recessive. So if you have a dominant allele and a recessive allele, you will look like the dominant allele. This is the kind of genetics that most people learn. This is not very common. Most genes don't work like this. But for this particular pair of birds, this particular gene, we do see that the pied is dominant over the wild green. So here's our parent that is two copies of the pied allele, and our other parent has two copies of the green allele. Remember, these alleles are on different chromosomes, and offspring can only get one copy of the chromosome from each parent. So this chromosome is represented in this box here. This chromosome is represented in this box. So if this was the male, this sperm would have this copy of the chromosome, and this sperm would have the other copy of the chromosome. And if this one was female, this box represents this chromosome, and this box represents the other chromosome. So the top box has one version of the chromosome, and the bottom box has the other version of the chromosome. Now, with this particular cross, there's no option for either of these. Both of these parents are what we call homozygous, meaning they have two copies of the same allele. So if we look at the birds here in the middle, these are all four potential genetic combinations for the offspring. This bird has one copy of the pied allele, one copy of the green allele, and this bird is pied. Same thing here, here, and here. If you've done Punnett squares before, you understand how this is going. This GP represents 50% of the sperm. And so we fill in the GP allele in the boxes underneath it. This GP represents the other 50% of the sperm, and so we fill in the boxes below. The first row represents 50% of the eggs, and the bottom row represents the other 50% of the eggs. Okay. Now, hang on, I need to check something real quick. Okay, so we're going to give you another example here. We're going to talk about budgies. And for budgies, the green color is dominant. So when you have dominant and recessive, you only need one copy of the dominant allele to show that phenotype. So this green budgie could either have the combination of two green alleles, two green versions of the gene, or one green and one blue. And this is where we use lowercase. We use that to indicate the recessive version. So the gene, we're calling this gene G, capital or G, and the capital G means it's green, the lowercase g means it's blue. To get the recessive phenotype, you need two copies of the recessive alleles. So to get a blue budgie, you have to have lowercase g, the two blue alleles. Ronit.
So I know that most characteristics are not governed by a single gene, but is it unusual to see the wild type being recessive?
Not necessarily. It's totally random whether it would be recessive or dominant. So if we one of the ways that this can happen where the wild type might be recessive we go back no, I don't like that one because I don't know how that one works. So when we're talking about colors. If the wild type is recessive, what is often happening there is that if you've got one wild type and one non-wild type allele, the non-wild type allele may be producing a pigment that is, the color of that pigment just overshadows the wild type pigment. So it's brighter or darker or something like that.
So are a lot of the actually wild birds not wild type color?
No, if the whatever color is normal in the wild birds is going to be what we call wild type. It's just random chance that, well, okay. When we talked about evolution, we kind of covered this, but if you think about budgies here or lovebirds here, that yellow here is a much brighter color. It's going to be easier to see that color than it is an all green bird. So there is evolutionary pressure for survival for the bird to be green. Now, if on the other hand, there was sexual selection going on and all the females were wanting to mate with pied males, that would be pressure for this version, this other version, to become the dominant one. I tell my physiology class students this all the time. It's always more complicated than you think. Are you kind of following? Okay. All right. So when we talk about these colors, and we look at this situation, I'm going to draw us another Punnett square. I'm going to draw it for these budgies. And we're going to say this green budgie, we're going to pick this combination of genes. So one column is going to be the capital G wild type green allele. The other column is going to be the blue allele, the recessive blue allele. So this is where we can look a little closer at this Punnett square and what exactly it means. So 50% of this bird's sperm are going to have the dominant wild type allele. So capital G, we just lead it down. The other 50% are going to have the recessive blue allele. And so we copy that down. The other bird, let's have this guy be blue. So blue is recessive to green. So he has to have 2 copies of the blue. That's the only allele that she can put into an egg. And so every egg, every one of her offspring is going to have that lowercase g. Oops. So when we look at this, we can see that there are 4 potential combinations of alleles. When we do these Punnett squares, each square represents potentially a 25% chance of that combination of alleles. So this square represents a 25% chance of that combination. This doesn't mean that if they have 4 kids, they're going to have 2 green and 2 blue. And when we have these 2 different alleles, make sure I've used all the terminology here. that is heterozygous. Homo means same, hetero means different. So this is a homozygous. It's homozygous dominant because it's also dominant. This is homozygous recessive. And then the one that I've circled is heterozygous. Okay. If these two birds only had 4 offspring, they could all be green, or they could all be blue, or they could be any combination thereof. The only time the numbers work out 25% of each genetic combination, each combination of alleles, is if you've got thousands of offspring. So it doesn't always, in a small number of offspring, it doesn't always show the right numbers of each type of offspring. I'm trying to make this very simple. How are we doing with this? Okay, Ronit's got it. How's everybody else doing? Really good. Oh, excellent. Glad to hear that. Okay. So that's the simple stuff. Sometimes there can be more than 2 alleles. And so when we look at pigeons here, in pigeons, there are multiple genes involved in color, but what we're looking at here is a gene called major color. So this particular gene is the major influence on the color of pigeons. And in this case, this color over here that's called ash red is the dominant, the most dominant allele. And we indicate that with a capital A. We tend to name alleles based on the most dominant characteristic. The second most dominant is blue. And so we're going to indicate that with a lowercase a. When I say second most dominant, that means ash red is dominant to blue, but blue is dominant to brown. Okay? Brown is recessive to both of these other colors. And so we indicate that with a lowercase a, and then we add this little apostrophe. We call it a prime rather than apostrophe. So that would be called A prime. And that's the brown color. All right, so that is how we indicate more than 2 different alleles. There are at least 2 other genes that influence color in pigeons. I'm using this one because it is a nice example of more than 2 different versions. There are other things I mentioned. It's not always dominant and recessive. So I want to give you some examples of some other types of inheritance patterns. This one is called incomplete dominance. And so there are 2 different alleles, and that results in a blended phenotype. So in chickens, there is an allele for white and an allele for black. So in chickens, we would write this one as WW. It is not dominant over black, so we would indicate black with capital BB. Black is not dominant over white, white is not dominant over black. This gray chicken at the bottom has incomplete dominance. So this hen has one white allele and one blue or black allele. And so she comes out gray. Okay, incomplete dominance right there.
Is that the same as codominance?
It is not. I wasn't going to talk about codominance because there are not a lot of good examples of codominance in a color. Literally the only example I know of is blood types in humans. I'm not a geneticist, so there probably are more out there, but that's the only one I know of. Okay. The next thing I want to mention is something called polygenic. Poly means many. Anytime you see a scientific word with poly in it, it means many. And genic, of course, we're talking genes. So this is multiple genes that affect the phenotype. This is the most common form of genetics. Most phenotypes have multiple genes involved. So in the pigeon, we know that there are at least 3 alleles in the physical appearance of the feathers, just the colors of the feathers. In humans, we know there are over 100 genes involved in our skin color. This allows the great diversity that we actually see in the real world. The most common way we see this is there are 1 or 2 genes that have the most impact. So when we said that blue versus ash red versus brown, that was the major color. That has the biggest impact. And the others are going to have slightly different impacts or milder impacts. And so in this image, we're going to talk about a gene that is called dilute. This is a very common thing to see in animal genetics. Genes that are called dilute determine the amount of pigment produced. So, I don't have a lot of space. In pigeons, the major color gene determines the type or color of pigment, and the dilute gene determines how much. It probably is similar to what we see in horses. Yes. The example I use when I'm teaching general genetics is I use Labradors because you've got a pale yellow, golden yellow, chocolate, and brown, and that's 2 genes involved. Same idea here, just not as obvious. So on the left, we have 2 pigeons that have the blue major color gene. We know that blue is dominant over ash, but we don't know what the second, I'm sorry, ash is dominant over blue. Hang on a second. Hang on. Did I write that wrong in my notes? I either wrote it wrong before, I'm writing it wrong now. I don't think it really matters. We're going to go with this because I've written it out as if blue is dominant over ash red. Sorry if I get you guys confused. So for this example, we're saying the blue is dominant over ash red. So we know that the pigeons on the left have one copy of the blue allele. We don't know what the other allele is. It could be brown, it could be ash red. Boy, I really screwed this one up. The one on the top is darker. The darker version of dilute is the dominant version of dilute. That produces more pigment. So again, we know they've got the dominant dilute allele, but we don't know what the other allele is. This guy is paler in color. There's less pigment here. So in this example, dilute is recessive, so we know it has to have two copies of the dilute allele. So we're saying that ash red is the second dominant. So it has to either have two copies of the ash red allele or an ash red and a brown. We're saying in this example that brown is the most recessive. This one is fully dark. So again, we know they've got the dominant version of the dilute and we don't know the other one. This guy has less color. So we know that the major color alleles are going to be the same options as this guy, but the dilute allele has to be two copies of the dilute. If you decide to breed pigeons and you care about the colors, don't go based on what I said, because obviously I screwed things up a little bit here. But the University of Utah has been studying this, and they have a program called Pigeonetics, where you can go in and learn all about genetics in pigeons. And they even have a little game you can play where you're trying to breed pigeons to make sure you understand all of the different types of genetic inheritance in pigeons. Okay, so hopefully I didn't confuse you guys too much. All right. So I wanted to go over another example where we have two genes involved, and we're going to be looking at budgies. And since I just took this whole picture from a textbook, we know this one's right. So in budgies, they can be green, blue, yellow, or white. There's also purple. We don't have purple on here. There are two genes that can be combined to make these four major color groups. And it's going to depend on two different parts of the feather. So the first phenotype is whether or not there is yellow pigment on the surface of the feathers. And it's very simply, there's either yellow pigment or there is not yellow pigment. So green has yellow pigment on the surface, yellow has yellow pigment on the surface. The blue color in budgies is produced by granules called melanin that are in the center of the feathers. So if we have a blue budgie, it's going to have melanin in the center and no pigment on the surface. To get green, we have yellow pigment on the surface and melanin on the inside. Blue and yellow make green. For yellow, yellow on the surface, no melanin pigment in the middle. For white, no pigment in either location. White color in birds is the absence of pigment and the absence of melanin. If you think about wild birds, there aren't a lot of them that are pure white. And the reason for that is that the pigment is important for strengthening the feathers. So white feathers are more likely to be weak. They're more likely to be damaged than colored, any color of feathers. So that's how that works in budgies. Now we're going to look at a polygenic situation, so multiple genes involved, and multiple alleles. So, polygenic, all of these are base blue pigeons, right? They all have that basic gray color. But we've got quite a difference in the appearances of them. So there's a second gene involved that has 4 alleles. Woof, it's getting complicated here. We call these T-check, check, bar, and barless. There is a dominant hierarchy of these 4. T-check is the most dominant allele. Check is second. Bar is third. And you'll notice the best place to determine these alleles is to look at the wings. Bar literally means there are bars on the wing. Check, there are patches on the wing. And T-check, it's almost all dark. Barless, all pale colored. So if we look down at these tables at the bottom, if the genotype has the T-check allele, it doesn't matter what the second allele is. It can be any of the 4 alleles, and the phenotype or the physical appearance is going to be T-check. So T-check allele gives you T-check on the wing. If you don't have T-check, but you have check, check is, if it's homozygous, you get checkered wings or checked wings. If the other allele is bar or the other allele is barless, you still get check. So if you don't have T-check, but you do have check, you have the check phenotype. Bar is third most dominant. If you have bar with bar or bar with barless, you get bar. So if you have T-check, it's T-check. If you don't have T-check, but you have check, it's check. If you don't have T-check or check, but you have bar, you have bar. The only way you get barless is if you have 2 alleles of barless. So it is recessive to all the others. You guys staying with me? Yes, good, glad to hear it. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about in genetics is linkage. Sometimes alleles seem to be inherited together. So you're consistently likely to see two phenotypes that go together frequently. In budgies, the gene that determines whether the body color is green or blue, so whether there's yellow on the outside of the feathers, and the gene that determines how much pigment is produced are very close together. They tend to be linked. When I say they're close together or linked, that means they are physically close together on the same chromosome. Now, non-linked genes that are on different chromosomes, those are not linked. There's no guarantee that those alleles will tend to go together. Whereas in this one, because they're close together on the same chromosome, those tend to go together. We can also have two genes on the same chromosome that are not considered linked if they are far away from each other. Whew. Why does this happen? Oh, this is complicated again. All right, so here is one copy of a chromosome. I've colored it red. Here is the other copy of that chromosome, which I've colored blue. Now, during the process where we make sperm and eggs, something weird can happen. And that something weird is called crossing over. So during meiosis, making sperm and eggs, we can have crossing over. And crossing over is where the two copies of the same chromosome physically exchange parts of themselves. So what we end up with, I'm going to move this over here, what we end up with after crossing over, come on, is the red chromosome has a little bit of the blue chromosome on the end, and the blue chromosome has some of the red chromosome on the end. And the further away these genes are, the more likely you're going to have a crossing over event. So this is getting into some serious genetics here. And this is one of the ways that we get so incredibly much diversity when we look at any species, because everybody has unique chromosomes that have not been seen in anybody before you. So some of your chromosomes can have information from your mother's father and your mother's mother. Whew. And once again, I'm saying this kind of stuff, it's always more complicated. And the last major thing I want to mention is what we call sex linkage. Okay, sex linkage applies only to genes on the sex chromosomes. So what are the sex chromosomes? In humans, and in most, but not all mammals, we define genetic females as XX and genetic males as XY. Now I'm indicating genetic females and genetic males because it's not always as easy as all this. Chances are good you do not know what your sex chromosome makeup is. I'm getting off on the side tangent here because you can have people who appear female who are XX or X and missing the other sex chromosome, or have 3 copies of the X chromosomes, or have an X and a Y, or have an XXXY. It's crazy the combinations of genes that we can have for someone who appears to be female. They may have a uterus, they may go through menstruation, they may feel female, but they could still have a Y chromosome. Crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So that's why I'm indicating this is genetic. In birds, they do things differently. The male is called ZZ. They have 2 copies of the Z chromosome, and the females are ZW. 1 copy of the Z chromosome, 1 copy of the W chromosome. All right. So when we look at birds, we're going to be looking at genes that are on the Z or the W chromosome. So here we go. Females, birds, have 1 Z chromosome. So, oops. A gene that is on that Z, the female only has 1 allele. So that's going to be the phenotype. And that also means all of her sons will get that allele because she only has 1 version to produce, to provide to any of her offspring. And only her sons get a Z chromosome. Her daughters get the W chromosome. And there's no color gene on the W. So the major, we're back to the major color allele, and it is on the Z chromosome. Ash red, blue, or brown are our options here. Males pass on 1 or the other Z chromosome. So if there's dominant recessive stuff going on, it's basically determined by which allele they got from their father. So let's walk through this example. We have an ash red male bird who's going to be the father, and a blue female who's going to be the mother. The Z chromosome on the mother has to be blue. There's no other option there. The ash red male can be either ash red or brown because he is heterozygous. He has 2 different alleles for the major color gene. Mom here gives her Z chromosome to her 2 sons. Both sons inherit that blue allele. She gives her W chromosome to her 2 daughters. The W does not have the major color gene. Dad gives the ash red allele to 2 of his offspring. one female, one male, and the other Z allele with the brown Z chromosome with the brown allele to the other daughter and the other son. So the sons, this son got the ash red allele from dad and the blue allele from mom. Ash red is dominant, so this bird is ash red. This son got the brown allele from dad and the blue allele from mom. Brown is dominant over blue. I'm sorry, blue is dominant over brown, so he is blue. This daughter got the W allele from mom, so it really matters which allele she got from dad. And in her case, she got ash red, so she's red. Her sister got the brown allele, so she's brown. And that is sex-linked inheritance in pigeons. Okay. And here I've got it written up here. Pigeons is Pigeonetics, the pigeon genetics website from the University of Utah, is very friendly to people who are not biologists, who have not had a lot of genetics, who are coming in not knowing much. It's a great website. And it can, like I said, it has some pigeon breeding puzzles to help you test your understanding. So I want to end with some very important points. Most traits have multiple genes contributing to them. It's not one trait, one gene. Eye color in human, 16 genes involved. Most genes have more than 2 alleles. We talked through some examples in pigeons that have 3 alleles, some that have 4 alleles. In humans, there's a condition called cystic fibrosis, which has over 1,000 alleles. Whew. Wow. And dominant recessive is the exception, not the rule. So it is not the most common way that we see genes being inherited. Okay. How do you guys feel about genetics now? Wow, okay. I either put everybody to sleep or everybody understood it well. Okay, I'm alive. Okay, good. Okay, thanks. Any animal that you want to breed, you should get a good grounding in genetics, and you should get an understanding of the genetics in that species. And that's our next topic, breeding. So a lot of things that I talk about here, I'm kind of focusing in on what's going on in birds, right? But a lot of the things that I ask you to consider when we're talking about breeding, like understanding the genetics involved, will also apply to if you're trying to breed snakes, or you're trying to breed dogs, or you're trying to breed horses, or anything like that. This is one of our California condors with a very, very young baby. All right. So let's talk about preparation for breeding. In the wild, the first step is finding a mate. In captivity, it's finding a mate too, but you would be doing it for your birds. In the wild, there's some decision making to be made. Male birds, as we saw in the evolution section, frequently use bright colors and elaborate songs to attract mates. So this is what we call a lek. Oops. And these are prairie chickens. So we've got male, 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 and a couple of females. I don't know how available genetic testing is for most animals. If the genetic testing is available, absolutely, strongly recommend. That doesn't guarantee that there will be no genetic disorders or abnormalities, because we can't even guarantee that in humans. We don't always know all the genetics involved in certain characteristics. I'm going to go back to one of my favorite examples, risk of cancer. So in humans, we know that there are certain genes that are involved that we know if you have a mutation, it increases your risk of cancer. But we also know that there are families that have more cancer than you would expect based on background numbers, the general population, the rate in the general population. So we know there are genes involved that we just haven't found yet. And it's definitely going to be the same problem in animals. Okay. When we were talking about evolution, we talked about how these displays, these colors, can also attract predators. And you've got to balance those. So a lek is a place where a bunch of males come together in a relatively small area. In prairie chickens, they each have their own little territory within the lek location. And they're going to be, as you could see, they stick their chest out and uncover this big white cluster of feathers that's normally hidden by their contour feathers. So these are white feathers that are normally hidden by contour feathers. And they will dance around, stomp their feet, make very loud noises to call out to the females. And the females will come, and you can see they don't look very interested this morning. This one looks asleep. This one looks asleep. This one looks asleep. This one looks like she's had maybe a sip of coffee, not quite ready to wake up and make her decision yet. The female comes, she's going to choose between these males who she's going to mate with. Species that do this kind of behavior, the male tends not to participate in raising the offspring. So the female will mate, she'll go off, she got her own nest, she does all the work. In other species, the male builds their nest, and they will demonstrate that. This isn't a good example of it because it's not really a nest. Okay. They will build a nest and use that to entice the female to come and choose him. A lot of times the females will look at the construction and use that to decide, this guy really put some effort into it and he made a good nest. I'm going to breed with him, because that suggests that he's going to do a good job taking care of our chicks. Sometimes she will tear it apart and supervise reconstruction. This one, I'm going to breed with you, but you didn't do things quite like what I wanted. Let's redecorate. This is a bowerbird display ground, so it's not truly a nest. The male builds this construct, and this is his display ground right here. But in order to get the female to come to his display ground, he is going to put down all of these colorful objects in his display area. And these can be natural, or they can be man-made. Yes, the females can be very picky. Absolutely. Well, wouldn't you? You might only have one chance to have babies. Don't you want the best baby daddy? This particular one mostly gathered whatever this orange, it looks like it might be a flower, and some blueberries, but he's also got some black something here and some purple something here. And they usually put them in clusters based on the color. And if you came along and you picked up some of these blueberries and put them over here, he would pick them up and put them back. He wants those bold, bright colors. So they spend a lot of time collecting objects, organizing them, and maintaining the design to show that they've got good genes. So we just talked about sex determination in birds. WZ is female and ZZ is male. These guys are interesting. These are eclectus parrots. Notice that the one on top is green. That's the male. In eclectus parrots, the female is the more colorful one. Generally speaking, there are the species where the female is more colorful. The male will often be drabber, and he will be the one who raises the chicks. So just looking at these two, I would say she's going to go lay eggs in his nest. He'll sit on the eggs. He'll raise the chicks. So this is obviously fertilization. Then it takes between 1 and 3 days for an egg to develop. So for it to be fully mature with the eggshell and everything. It may take, depending on the species, she may need to mate for each individual egg, or she may be able to take sperm from one mating and use it for a series of eggs. And then once the egg is laid, one or both parents may take care of the egg. All right, so this picture, we have a hummingbird egg here. This is an ostrich egg, and this is an elephant bird egg. So elephant birds were freaking massive. I think that's a hummingbird egg, actually. Hummingbird eggs are bigger than you would expect for the size of the hummingbird. So elephant birds are extinct, but there are a few eggs in museums. They went extinct relatively recently, and they could be found on the island of Madagascar until basically we hunted them. So this is my ostrich egg. So you can see it's probably not quite as big as you expected. Certainly not as big as an elephant bird egg. This is an emu egg. Notice this one has a very different shape than the ostrich egg and a very, very different color. This one is very dark green. It's one of the darker green ones I've seen. And if I broke it open, you could see the color on the inside as well. Yeah, some of them have colors. So my emu egg has some white spots. Most of them are really small. Other birds do have lots of dots on their eggs. So once the egg is laid, the parents, one or both of them, incubate the egg, keeping it at the appropriate temperature for the chick to finish developing. If there's only one parent incubating, it's usually the female, but not always. Even if the female's doing most of the incubation, the male sometimes is involved in feeding the female. Sometimes they're involved in raising the chicks, even if they don't incubate the eggs. In birds, having both parents incubate is the most common thing to see. Laura says she has a question. Can you either write it in the chat or?
So my question is, so when you have an egg, right, like some eggs require, like, do you have to have like that sunlight directly on it for it to like hatch correctly? Because like in areas where it's colder, they don't get as much sunlight, or like no sunlight at all. What do they do?
They don't really need sunlight on the egg for hatching. They just need the right temperature. So that's
Oh, so the light's more for the temperature, but not the like the use of the light.
yeah, it's temperature, not light. Yeah.
Okay. Because when I go to like the Topsail Fair, I'll see like in like the bird place or the equine area or like the avian area, they have like this little display of like eggs, and like they have like it in an incubation thing. But I was like, oh, is it more for the heat or for the light?
If they're incubating them under light, the light is only there for heat or so that they can monitor for signs of hatching. That's the only reason you would have lights on them. Okay. Having both parents take turns incubating the eggs is the most common way for this to go. And incubation lasts from 2 weeks to about 2 months. You might get some very rare individuals outside of that range, but that's kind of your average range right there. Once the egg hatches, then you've got babies, you've got chicks. And again, there's so much diversity in the way birds do things. In some species, both parents take care of the chicks. In some species, only one parent will take care of the chicks. And it could be the female, slightly more commonly the female, but sometimes it is the male. In the ratites and in poultry, like ducks, geese, chickens, the young are born precocial. These are shorebirds, and shorebirds are also born precocial. What that means is that these chicks are more developed at hatching. They're able to get up and run after their parents. And they're very quickly able to start finding their own food. Okay. Laura knows that in eagles, I'm assuming you're talking the bald eagle, the eggs hatch after about 35 days. Yep, that's the incubation period. Absolutely. So a little more than a month there. Okay. if you've heard of imprinting, where a newly hatched goose, usually it's geese or duck, sees a person before it sees its own parent, it'll start following the person around. My theme for today is it's more complicated than that. But when we talk about imprinting, the species that this can happen with are the precocial babies. Imprinting is when chicks learn to recognize their parent. It has to happen early, usually within half a day of hatching, so not even a whole day. And so these chicks will leave the nest early and follow their parent or parents around. And the parent will show them, here's food, here's danger, here's a safe place for you. We can use imprinting for captive hatched wild species that need to follow somebody in order to migrate. So most birds learn to migrate. They're either following their parents, or they know by instinct, or they follow others of their same species. If the birds have to follow their parents and we're raising them in captivity, we have to teach them how to migrate. And so we do this with cranes. Notice that their flight feathers are black. Remember how I said white feathers are weaker? A lot of white birds that have to do a lot of flying will have black flight feathers. Oh, that guy absolutely knows they're following him. They raised these cranes to be imprinted on this ultralight plane. And so they're using this ultralight plane to train these birds how to migrate. And yes, there's a movie called Fly Away Home that's kind of about this. That's the good way of imprinting. Imprinting can also go bad. When an animal imprints on the wrong species, they may not learn how to find food. They may not be able to find an appropriate mate. They may not know, hey, that's what my species looks like. You can get imprinting in birds that are raised by people if they're not raised carefully and correctly. So usually people who don't know what they're doing, they think, oh, this baby owl is so cute and I'm going to cuddle it and I'm going to snuggle it because I just love baby owls and he's so cute. And then it grows up to be a great horned owl. And then you have an incident where Fish and Wildlife have to deal with the problem of a great horned owl that steals food from people's hands and has injured a child. Speaking from an actual incident that happened. Fortunately, they were able to catch that owl and bring it into captivity. So this is an example of imprinting going very, very wrong. All right. It is the end of our time together. Does anybody have any questions or anything they want to say?
Yeah, did that person then say it wasn't them that did that?
Excuse me?
So when that person like made that mistake or like had to like give up that bird, that they were like, oh, it wasn't me. Because like I feel like if that can't they find them if they
Oh, yes. Yes.
So yeah, then they'd be like, yeah, it wasn't me.
Yeah. So they raised it, let it go, let it be wild, let it be free. But they didn't know what they were doing. And
I just feel bad because first of all, they didn't know it was going to grow up to be a great horned owl. But like if they had done the research, maybe they could have found out.
yeah, this is why raising wild birds is pretty much illegal for people who don't have a permit. is
Oh,
to
no, I-
prevent things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel sorry.
Sucks, but like,
Feel sorry for the bird
yeah,
and the kid that got attacked.
you know how old the kid was?
Young.
That's-
I know they were having a picnic
Oh,
and
God.
the bird came down and tried to take food out of
Like
the,
it's like the Birds movie, but with owls.
yeah. All right, if there's nothing else, then boy, everybody's saying have a good weekend today. My morning class was saying that too. Guys, I hate to tell you, but it's only Tuesday. I'll see you on Thursday. Bye.